Good afternoon. My name is Apollinaire Jikeng. I'm visiting from the International Livestock Research Institute. Really delighted to be facilitating this exceptional session this year in the Ball of Dialogue. It is about reimagining partnership to transform the agri-food innovation chain. And we have with us here a significant panel. I would like to be very brief in the introduction so that we can hear and get the most out of them. We are about catalyzing and nurturing partnership to accelerate ideas to impact. Often we do proof of concept, but we never fail to respond on time in taking new ideas to impact. The agri-food systems today are really complex. They are very diverse. They're also under significant pressure. Some of the pressure are related to what we know, but a significant part of the pressure is about the climate and also funding for R&D. How can we really reimagine partnership to ensure that we can make the most out of what we're able to offer? It's about increasing R&D, as I mentioned, but what are the drivers that we can really focus on to ensure that the R&D investment is increased and that we can very quickly connect new ideas to impact? We have in front of us here a significant panel, as I mentioned. Let me introduce them very briefly. We have Diana Horvath of the 2Blades Foundation. We have Phil Pardee from the University of Minnesota, really known for the GEMS Informatics. We'll hear more about it. We have Ian Pudifat from PepsiCo. PepsiCo is known for the drinks, but I think he's going to tell us a bit more about what PepsiCo is known about. We have our own Juanluca Restrepo, the Director General of the Alliance for Biodiversity and SIAT. And finally, we have Ty from Bayer Crop Science. I think they will tell us a lot more about what we need to do to accelerate connect R&D from impact, discovery to impact. To set the scene, let me hand over to Phil Pardee to really set the scene and get us through this conversation. Phil, over to you.
Thanks, Apollinaire, and delighted to be here. And as Apollinaire mentioned, I thought we'd unveil some new investment data that we're about to release in a few weeks' time to sort of give us a perspective on the current structure of the agri-food R&D system worldwide. And over the past 4 decades, the aggregate trends are pretty impressive. We've had nearly a trebling in the total amount of public and private investment in agri-food research from around 38 billion in 1980 to around 110 billion in 2021. But beyond those aggregates, there's a seismic shift in the structure of where and who is doing that research. Our estimates indicate that around half of the world's agri-food R&D spending now takes place in the middle-income countries. Half of that total now occurs in the Asia-Pacific region. So that is a huge geopolitical and geospatial shift in the location of agricultural research. And of probably importance for the panel's discussion today, half of that total is now done by the private sector. So we're no longer looking in an increasing number of countries of systems that are dominated by public systems, but the reach of the private sector is now spreading well beyond the richer countries and moving heavily into the upper middle income and lower middle income countries and further down the spectrum. Of that 110 billion total, just 10 countries account for 70% of that total. 3 of those countries are middle-income countries, and they're the large agricultural economies of China, India, and Brazil. But perhaps a reflection of that concentration on the flip side is this huge growing geographical disparity in agricultural R&D spending and a sort of growing global R&D divide. We estimate that back in 1980, the low-income countries spent collectively about $7.50 for every $100 spent by the rest of the world. Fast forward to nowish, in 2021, that low-income country total has shrunk to 98 cents for every $100 spent by the rest of the world. So that gap has grown dramatically over the last 4 decades. Of real concern in our new data, and I think, again, underscoring the need for the conversation today, is that there's a big slowdown, if not cutting back, in global spending in recent years. If we look at the rate of growth in the post-2015 and the pre-2015 period, we estimate that in aggregate, the rate of growth in spending worldwide has slowed by a third since 2015 relative to the decades that preceded it. Very worryingly, almost half of the world's countries are now growing at a slower pace in their R&D spending than they did prior to 2015. And almost a third of the world's countries, well beyond a rich country phenomena, which is what it was several decades ago, around a third of the countries are actually cutting back in inflation-adjusted terms in investments in public and private food and ag R&D. So this slowdown is across the stage of development board, and as I said, is no longer just a rich country phenomenon. And this is especially worrying because we're now casting the die for what the agricultural knowledge stock's going to look like 15 to 20 years out because of the long lags between spending R&D dollars and actually having an impact on the ground, not just in farmers' fields, but along the whole sort of value chain. And so it doubles down on the need to be really thinking about strategies to deal with this new reality where we have a diminished rates of growth, if not cutting back in R&D spending, and we have a substantial rise in the role of the private sector. So clearly the obvious conclusion is that we need all of us to advocate and pressure for a reverse in the current spending trends to bring about not just a substantial increase, but a sustained increase in R&D spending. But we also need to start rethinking about the relationships between the public and private sectors. And we need to, I think, innovate in the way we innovate. We're going to have to do not perhaps more with, we're going to have to do more with not particularly less in many cases, but in some cases definitely less R&D funding. And so we need to think very carefully about how we couple incentivising the financing and the conduct of R&D and the institutional reforms that are going to take place, not just the technical change, but the institutional changes that are going to be needed in the decades ahead, including private, for-profit, private non-profit and public sector agencies to speed up the development and commercialisation of agri-food innovations around the world. And I think in the previous session we heard a call for sort of intelligent reforms on regulations that can hinder private investment as well as the release and adoption of new technologies. And so I think those elements will come up in our conversation today. So hopefully that sets the scene for us.
Thank you, Phil. Really like what you said in the what to do. Innovate, do more with less, but also institutional reforms. I think we can come back to that. So let me start with the two colleagues here representing the private sector. The question is to you, Ty and Ian. So can you please share with us your approach to R&D from the private sector perspective?
Yeah, sure. So
there is an echo. So.
Yeah, there's a bit of an echo. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to this panel. Great to be here with everybody. Maybe just I'll give you a little bit of a background. So I think most people know what the big multinational ag companies do in general, but for Bear Crop Science, I kind of break it into like three different areas. The first area are the main crops that we work in, and these are global in nature. Corn, cotton, soy, canola, vegetables, we have a business there. We work in wheat and rice as well. So some of the big row crops that impact a large part of the world's agricultural productivity areas. The geographies that we work in also end up having probably the most infrastructure to allow us to do those things. There's infrastructure where irrigation is required, financing is required, talent is local and abundant. And so that's the reason that we're in those countries with those crops. It has the biggest impact that we can make when we have the higher acreage that we can impact with new technologies. And then if you think about the technology platforms that we invest in, these span from large to small farms if we want to scale them. So obviously biotech, plant biotech is one of our main focus areas. We've invested heavily in biotech for over 30 years now. I think there's 67 traits in the market that have been invented that are helping growers deal with insect pests, weeds, and disease, and even drought. We have a crop protection division that's pretty heavily invested around the world, mostly in horticulture, but in row crops as well, to help growers deal with the same kinds of pests. More importantly, I think we've begun to move towards some new technologies that are a bit easier to manage in some respects, a little bit harder in others. So we also have a biologics business. Over time, the biologics products that have been in the market haven't really applied themselves to the level that we were hoping for decades ago in the big row crops. We've also taken a pretty serious look at genome editing. And so genome editing provides an entirely new pathway for us to think about the kinds of technologies that we want to invest in. Depending on the regulatory systems that occur, whether that's in China, Europe, right now the two primary the geographies that we're focused on, this could have a pronounced impact on new developments in agriculture. These should not and hopefully will not be subject to the same kinds of regulations that biotech products have in the past. These are the same kinds of traits that you can develop through traditional breeding, but you can do it pretty fast. You can do these in 5 to 7 years, where traditional breeding could take you a lot longer. Other platforms like genomics, breeding, areas that we've constantly focused on over years to try to increase genetic gains in those crops that we care about. And then more recently, artificial intelligence. And where that comes into play isn't for necessarily increasing automation or dealing with operational things, but really helping us develop hypotheses that we haven't been able to execute before. So if you think about protein design in the space of biotechnology, we've all in the industry worked on new BT proteins, but this is decades-old technology. Artificial intelligence is now allowing us to do things and test in the lab before we ever get into a plant what could actually work. And so all of these new technologies, they're scalable depending on where we want to go. And we'll talk about this concept later of dual markets, dual geographies, dual crops. But where we spend our money is in this area so that we can have the biggest impact around the world. And we do have our vision is health for all and hunger for none. And this is how we kind of view the way that we can at least help get to that realization.
Thank you, Ty. You mentioned a number of technologies, but also mentioned only few crops. And we know that the world will cannot continue to rely only on few crops. I'll come back to you on how you could select some of the crop opportunity crops to put into your pipeline. So Ian, please, as you answer the question, you could also bring into context how you bring other crops into your commercial pipeline, as it were.
Sure. Let's get this microphone in a good place. So I work for PepsiCo. I'm the R&D lead for ingredients in our foods portfolio. PepsiCo owns the world's largest food brand, just to give you some context, which just happens to be Lay's potato chips. We also own a number of other brands that go across different food domains as well. So I find this interesting, hopefully you do as well. One interesting snippet is that PepsiCo's portfolio contributes about 16% of all whole grain portions of food consumed in North American diets on an annual basis. That's a commitment that we have to quadruple that by 2030. How are we going to get there? We're going to use additional whole grain sources across a range of diverse ingredients. Just to answer Apollinaire's challenge, that's one of the things that we're doing, is trying to incorporate additional and more diverse ingredients into the portfolio of products that we create. Within our food system within PepsiCo, we are what I call vertically integrated. So under my responsibility, I look after our agricultural science team, and we breed our own potato varieties, something that the company has been doing since the 1940s, and we breed our own oats. We're highly dependent on corn, and we're highly dependent on oilseed crops as well. We don't do our agricultural science in isolation. We have a number of partnerships to enable us to work in the space, because we're not an agricultural science company. We're a food company, and we look at sourcing materials for our products in a reliable and productive and sustainable fashion. So an example, oats. Currently, I believe, about just a tad over 1% of total world grain production is an oat. About 20% of oats produced go into food, and we purchase about 30% of that fraction. So we're quite big in a very tiny space, and that's the challenge. So this is a crop that economically is challenged to grow when you put it against something like soy or corn. How do you produce enough oats to feed your oatmeal when you're making oatmeal? You need to make sure that growers have access to varieties and agronomic practices that make it economically viable, and that we can get the right kind of food oat quality. So we have specifications in both oats and potato that are quite difficult to get to. So unless we take an active role in ensuring that growers have access to the right varieties, the right agronomic practices, we don't win, and neither do they, and then we don't have products in the markets for consumers. So we've done a number of things in those spaces. So over my tenure, we've co-invested with Corteva, for example, to sequence the oat genome. It's a publicly available resource now. We did it because nobody else was going to do it. And we need it as a foundational unlock to support a broad spectrum of R&D to enable people to advance other aspects of research in varieties. We've built, using public research collaborations with a number of academic institutes, we built a crop model for oat to understand how oats grow from seed to harvest, and we've used that to create agronomic practice unlocks to lower the amount of nitrogen and time nitrogen inputs into the crop. We estimate today that that's saving us about 10% of the GHG footprint in oat cultivation. And we have the science data to back that up as well. So those things that we have done lift the base of the industry. It's what we call, bringing the tide in to rise all the boats, because we all benefit from that perspective. We also use some of those insights to create proprietary unlocks as well. I won't deny that. There are some things that we can do with that information that allow us to create advantage in our own business stream as well. And when we do that, we're creating value for our company, but we're also creating value for the growers that grow for us. And that lifts their capability and provides a piece of another commitment that we have, which is to help increase the value of livelihoods in the local communities that we work with. So that's just a couple of examples of how we look at partnership and what we do with it.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Ty. So we know that context is really important. And on this panel here, we have Juan Luca, who represents the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT, and more importantly, the bigger CGR family. Please bring into context the reality in the global south, where we are largely dependent on small-scale growers.
Thank you, Apollinaire. Great to be here, and after listening to Phil, and from where I'm sitting, we are surrounded by the private sector, meaning in terms of trends, R&D of the private sector is covering a lot of ground, and we need to acknowledge it and reposition our work and ourselves. So a couple of things, two ideas I need to bring in this first part of the conversation. The first one is to acknowledge those shifts and see how we adapt and accommodate. And the next one is that we still need to fight and ensure that there is space for public goods, and that those public goods are well embedded in this new research and development space. So on the first one, of course, from a CG research center, we cannot swim against the current, but rather adapt to those changes in investment flows, where we need to reposition our role and leave behind or contribute differently to work areas or geographies where these R&D and SOMNARs are coming very strongly. We also need to become sharper at the ideation, development, deployment continuum. We waste too much time with solutions that may not fit exactly those markets and do not come from proper ideation from those markets. And we have two CG platforms, Accelerate for Impact and the RAM, that are bringing our scientists into those spaces, innovation challenges, to really help them connect in a better manner. And then, of course, we still have 500 million small farmers producing 1/3 of the world's food, where there is huge opportunity in terms of spaces, opportunity crops, etc., where our role is perfectly complementary to that of the private sector and this investment. And then, in terms of the public goods, they remain essential. We need to focus our research efforts so they can be taken up by different entities across different users, different geographies. That's the nature of what we do, and make sure that we position them well to reinforce and complement the efforts of others. We also need to, and what we heard from PepsiCo, we need to better learn how to participate in private sector consortia in the pre-competitive space. That's where private sector feels a great opportunity to collaborate and partner. And then, of course, understand in our work how we use the market pool. And it could be because of new opportunities from consumers as they're changing their habits, or it could be also from public policies, for example, school feeding programs that can really generate these very strong dynamics.
Thank you. I think we can really go a bit deeper into the partnership. So I would like to turn to Phil and Diana. Phil, you mentioned in closing, we need institutional changes. So how would you frame that to strengthen and really accelerate in building relevant partnerships?
Yeah, perhaps reflecting on some of our experiences at the University of Minnesota, where we've been working hard to try and bridge this sort of public-private divide. And in doing so, we've been working through to sort of rethink the shared value proposition in agri-food R&D data. So the immediate end result game of R&D, whether it's done by the public or private sector, is data, and that data then translates into technologies and new innovations and so forth. And if you step back a little bit, much of the data created by the public-funded R&D is de facto treated as a public or a common good and is made freely available to users, although it's not freely available to create or to maintain or sustain. And much of the data created by privately funded R&D is covered with IMP, and most of it's retained within companies, although as some of the examples we gave and Ian mentioned, where there's sort of pre-commercialisation shared interest in solving some problems, that it helps to writ large for innovation to release that more widely. And so we've been working in the GEMS Informatics Centre to literally put sort of the technical and legal infrastructure in place to use data as an incentive structure and think about data as an asset to incentivise partnerships between public and private sector, and think about supporting open data on the one hand and private data on the other, but more importantly, to think about purposely pooled data that brings innovation partners together in ways that they otherwise wouldn't, where they have clear control over the sort of access and use rights of that data. And so very practical examples that we've been able to achieve in the last few years is that we now support 13 research consortia funded by the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research on our platform that involves about 28 public and private partners working in pre-commercialisation space on collective research of importance to all of the members within those teams. We're partnering with 2Blades to help in them unlock some of the strategies that they've been successfully developing around gene discovery and gene deployment in a sort of market segmentated way that Diana, I'm sure, will give some insight into. And we've been working with PepsiCo on a whole range of research that's spanning both the public and the private sector, and a host of other examples I could give. So I think there are tangible, practical ways that we can proceed to go beyond the rhetoric of public-private partnerships and think about ways to incentivise those partnerships so that it's a mutual value proposition for those engaged in them.
Okay. So Diana, you lead the 2Blades, and you sit in a very interesting space. You collaborate with a range of institutions, universities, the CGI, and the private sector. From your perspective, what are some of the key things that we must address so that innovation around partnership can be effective?
I think in the current situation in which many of us are working, that there's been a collapse of a lot of funding. And so an obvious way to think about some of these partnerships is creating funding opportunities. And I want to start out by saying that as we engage with private sector partners, the expectation might be is that they're going to step in and fund everything. Clearly, that's not how it will work. And we appreciate that, but as a nonprofit organization that works at the interface of the private and public sector, we're really looking to build a new model that allows the incentives to incur for each of our partners based on their own needs. And so the endpoint that we're really trying to establish and create win-wins is by accepting those incentives, accepting that private sector partners have a need to control intellectual property, have exclusive rights, but how can we carve out benefits where it's not competitive to them and where we can leverage those rights for more social benefit. And that's what 2Blades has set up to do, test a model to have that kind of an experiment, basically, to see can we make that work. And that's experiment's been going on for more than 20 years, so spoiler alert, we think it's working. But the key there is to acknowledge, accept the incentive structures, the returns that are needed by different partners, and make sure that those can be realized in a win-win sort of basis. So at 2Blades, our focus is how can we translate improvements from the discovery side in the laboratory and get them into practical use. And there's a real gap there from discovery where, as we like to joke, our academic collaborators will say, conceptually solved. And so they'll have worked out the intellectual part of it, but there's a whole lot of work that goes to turning that concept or in a model system into something that works in the field for a crop. And that's the space that we occupy and try to move those discoveries into validation and in the field. So we have an unusual structure in that we have 2 laboratories embedded in academic institutions, one at the University of Minnesota and one in the Sainsbury Laboratory in the UK. And we work in this way to be close to the discovery side, but we appreciate that across the initial inception of an idea to having impact of that innovation in the field, that there are different skill sets, and the academic community is an open source system. They're really there to explore blue sky research, drive openness and innovation, and publish papers. And that can be fundamentally opposed to private sector research where they want to protect and ensure that their investments bring a return. So we try to be that gap. We take the translational part, we validate it, we de-risk it, and therefore we can deliver it to other partners. And those partners can be in the private sector, but we also partner with a lot of the public sector too, as Apollinaire, you were referring. One example for that is soybean. We have been working in soybean for about 16 years. And as an example of how we operate, we used our own resources to initially pilot some solutions. And in this case, we're interested in preventing pre-harvest losses by addressing significant crop pests and disease. In this case, soybean rust, which is the biggest disease that's been afflicting Brazilian soybean. And so we piloted it to a certain stage, and then we engaged with, through 3 partnerships with Corteva and with Bayer, and we have delivered resistances into their pipelines, and we've now used the resources and skills that we developed through those experiences, those programs, to create these resources and reserve rights from those programs that we can then implement for smallholders. And now we're turning our sights onto how we can benefit African soybean production, which is a nascent field. Soybean is a very important crop for aquaculture and livestock in Africa, and we know that soybean rust is the biggest limitation there as well. So we are making sure that we can have the benefits of those collaborations where we've delivered the private sector need for the public sector. And so in this model, we address how we can improve partnerships by ensuring that our academic partners can achieve what they need to achieve, our private sector partners can achieve what they need to achieve, and we also benefit from developing not only skills and resources that we can then leverage, but we also get a fair market value from commercial success. And that helps us to continue to pilot programs. So it's really about aligning the incentives that make this model work.
Thank you, Diana. 20 years of an experiment. I think there is a lot that we can learn from there. Thanks for sharing. I want to turn now back to our colleagues from the private sector. With what Diana has laid, turning to universities, private sector, and other elements. Ty, what's your approach for combining market investment, philanthropy, and dual market?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. And I guess in my mind, I think about it in 3 kind of distinct categories, and they still overlap with each other a little bit. But you can think of it as pure collaboration. And so I think what Diana described is one of those where we can collaborate using our technology platforms. It could be genetics, it could be anything that I described earlier, in collaboration with the initiatives and the science and the product concepts that 2Blades brings to us. We have a value that we can see in the markets that I described. She can see a value in other parts of the world where we just wouldn't have the footprint for it to make sense. And I think part of it comes back to the regulations that are so onerous in some areas that it makes it just untenable for us to kind of push through those, given the return on the other side from a pure profit, not from a humanitarian perspective, but a pure profit perspective. So it makes it inhibitive for us. But if we can leverage this collaborative kind of experiment, 20-year experiment, and actually see these things show up in the channel in on growers' acres, that to me is total success. And I love this example. I love this model. We're working in other areas outside of the 2Blades collaboration, but with Gates Ag 1 and Gates Foundation to do the exact same thing. They have a need for crops like cowpea, where we're just not going to be doing things in cowpea, but our technologies could actually enable them to do things that would help growers where cowpea is cultivated and needed as a staple. So that's the collaboration piece, and there's many examples. There's the cooperation piece, and for me, this is an area where if there's a need and a challenge, and I think we talked a little bit about this earlier, but if you take the TR4 Banana Consortium, there's a group of people, a group of scientists that know there's a need to deal with diseases in Cavendish bananas, and there's not a lot of genetic variation. So what can we do? When that consortium approached us, we have the ability to sequence genomes of pretty much any crop for not very much money and in a very fast time frame. So we're able to provide genomic sequences back to those scientists, into those labs, and then they can take that information, that data, and begin to use it to solve problems that we just probably wouldn't be doing or investing in. And that spans lots of different places as well. We've set up laboratories in the University of Wisconsin, donated our transformation technologies of how to transform plants with genes. And then anybody can come to that center and ask for those resources, and we've provided that IP free of royalties, not something that we're going to be making any profit on, but there's crops and regions that we just wouldn't go into that others can. The Danforth Center in St. Louis is another really good example. And so those are opportunities where we can take the IP that's been generated for the geographies, crops, and technologies that we've invested in, and then leverage those to provide benefit somewhere else that isn't going to be within our core business set. So that's collaboration, cooperation, and then I think the last one, and I would characterize as more community or market enablement. And so last year when I was here, I had the privilege of announcing a $32 million corn processing facility in Zambia. So obviously this is a benefit to us because we'll be able to bring better hybrid corn into Zambia, meeting some of their goals for their future of 10 million metric tons of high quality corn seed for that region. You can't do that without a certified seed program. You can't do that without advances in the genetic gains that you can make in crops like corn and soybean. So by putting a facility there, we will be able to sell seed into the market there. And that's got this knock-on effect that it's actually pretty amazing when we've seen the progress in just 1 year. So we built the facility, opened it up, hired people from the local community, trained them. They're getting education as well as being employees. But it also attracts other investment that way, right? And so we talked last year about MasterCard and John Deere and others were involved in maybe wanting to come into regions where you've been able to establish what might be good for one part of the agricultural channel and then bring in resources that make the community better. I think you said it earlier, right? The tide lifts all boats. So we've got a goal in mind. Other companies can come in and participate in that as well. So those are the kinds of the 3 areas that we focus on that are not necessarily core to our overall corn, cotton, soybean business, and not necessarily focused on BT, proteins, and crop protection, but we can use that knowledge base to leverage it and these kind of collaborations, cooperation, and then finding markets like Zambia where it can all come together and we can make a really big difference in communities in countries like Zambia.
Okay, thank you so much, Ty. Ian, I would like you to address this similar area, but as you do that, how, as a company, do you maintain a balance between food security and creating market?
Thank you. I was going to cheekily say, and I am going to say it now, could I have an easier question? One of the benefits that I have working for a large corporation is that I have lots of colleagues. So I work in R&D. We have a global agricultural organization that covers our procurement, how we buy from supply chains, and we also have an operations organization that's involved in that as well. And we also have a global sustainability office, and we have a PepsiCo Foundation. As a business, we make commitments about how we approach designing food and beverages in trying to stay within planetary boundaries for the good of people and for the planet. So it gives us a lot of potentially different levers to pull. We've invested in looking at how we get technology adoption in our grower community, how we de-risk that by knowledge transfer, how we demonstrate and pilot that. And actually, I think we've had active partnerships with Bayer, in fact, on demonstration farms about moving technology from research through development into application and into daily use. More recently, we've invested in what we call a future farm concept, where we're starting to test our varieties and look at how we maximize agronomic performance within a commercial farming operation. And we're doing that in a supply chain relevant way. So we have future farms in North America, we have future farms in Western Europe, we have future farms in Asia, and so on. So we test within practices that are relevant. And that gives us a form of resilience. That's how we drive resilient supply. But we need resilient communities that are capable of doing that growing as well. And one thing that our PepsiCo Foundation has been able to do was to partner with the CARE Foundation, looking at how in some of our markets in Asia and in particular in India, where we are dependent on many thousands of growers to supply us, how we get involved in the communities that they're in, how we educate them about other things that are important in their lives, about how to grow fresh fruit and vegetables within their own farming operation so that they become food secure, nutritionally robust, and so on. So knowledge transfer is really key. And it's not just knowledge transfer to drive productivity and sustainability from the field, it's knowledge transfer to the grower and to a community to empower them to be an active part of supply chains. So a duality of market value. It has a community and also an economic value in terms of creating pull and value for produce.
Thank you. Juan Luca, I'll turn to you. Can you highlight one, but probably not two, examples of partnerships in the CG for greater efficiency to push productivity?
Sure, Apollinaire. What we're learning is that given our long-standing work, our efforts around gene banks, etc., we have in our hands very critical assets that can be leveraged through these novel ways of partnering. One project that we implement with you, with ILRI, is about identifying in the forages, gene banks, anti-methanogenic compounds that can be then delivered to support a more sustainable livestock sector. We have probably the few, if not only, gene editing platform with freedom to operate in the tropics, and we're going with private sector support for gene editing cocoa to make sure that when the people are ready to have that technology taken, we can have cocoa plants that are not uptaking cadmium from soil anymore. And this again is our capacities, our platform, and the private sector collaboration. There is also the good examples of in-licensing. So we just launched, and this is from last week, our first rice variety with BAS technologies for herbicide resistance. And this is first time CG does these kind of things, meaning that we are thinking out of the box. We are not so scared to discuss IP in licensing, out licensing with exclusive specific market uses, etc., to leverage our business. Little example, ingredient from the product side. We are helping deepen cassava farming with cassava that have specific starches that are then purchased by this company. So there is a full cycle procurement and value chain approach. So across centers, there is a lot of innovation on how to link better with private sector, and not only with large, but with small. And especially in the upscaling side of things, it's super critical to partner with SMEs across countries, and SMEs are one of the ingredients of success. For example, for the PABRA network, 27 years with already 35 million households consuming beans that are not only bread, but purchased at the farm gate and then sold and brought into consumers. This is another way of partnering with private sector initiative at the SME level is also very critical.
Thank you, Juan Luca. We could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about the resources and the successes coming out of the CG. So we really want to position that system at the center of some of the partnerships, not only connecting to the global north, but also the global south and looking at the small scale producers. So when we started this session, I drew your attention to the QR code, and I hope you have answered some of the questions. So that was in lieu of the audience participation, so we are now ready to reveal what the answers are. So are we ready? And our distinguished panelists will offer some comments based on the results. Hope not too many surprises. Okay. Just be patient, a few more seconds. Okay, first question here, it was, okay, it's gone. This is the first question. Okay, Phil, will you comment on this? Can you see it? How effective do you believe current agricultural R&D model are in addressing today's global challenges?
I think the answers sort of probably reaffirm my own prejudices and perceptions that we've got a ways to go. I think in particular, as I mentioned at the opening, I think the landscape has just changed fundamentally in the marketplace we're working in. And I have a sense, particularly in countries like here, which is now almost 70% private food and ag R&D, I tend to think of the food and ag sector as the rest of the biological sciences. It actually looks increasingly like the health sciences in terms of that public-private participation. And that sector over the last 3 or 4 decades has undergone a fundamental change in the way they do research in health sciences in academic environments and think very effectively about translational research to get that into markets. And I think we've got to start, as I mentioned, innovate the way we innovate, and particularly think about strategies to couple financing structures with research execution. And there are lots of good examples around that start to explore new avenues for refinancing research in a way that I think, as Diana said, aligns the incentive structures for the participants in ways that they're prepared to put money into the game because they're going to get value out of it. And some of that value is a shared value proposition in a pre-commercialisation activities. Some of it is true sort of global public goods. But I think there's a lot of essentially club goods where you can incentivise people to gain access to not just data, but analytical tools and other intellectual property that actually facilitates collaboration within that club and between clubs, which is quite different than just thinking about public goods where it's all freely available and private goods where it's all locked up for an individual. And so I think thinking about incentive structures that are coupled with financing structures linked to how we execute research and placing, as a final call, it's been mentioned a couple of times today, but probably not stressed enough, the new realities of farmers sitting in increasingly integrated value chains. So as economies develop, those farmers get increasingly linked in both downstream and upstream in those value chains. And I think Ian touched on a lot of the sort of thinking from the sort of consumer end and the demand pull, I think were the words you used, and how that reaches back down into the particular forms of technologies that farmers deploy, generates not just on-farm value, but increasingly off-farm value. So in an environment like the US, 90 cents in the food dollar in an agri-value chain is earned post-farm. And that's just as legitimate value add in an agri-food value chain as on-farm value add. And so as to the extent that consumers are having a bigger stake in the sorts of sourcing issues that they put around food production, therein lies some real market opportunities, but we have to be attuned to those to actually realise that value for people, not just on farms, but across that whole value chain.
Thanks, Phil. Let's move to the second question, Wilson, please. Your views in moving innovations from concept to impact, that it can take decades.
This
Diana.
one's for me.
Yes.
Frustration seems to be the leading response to the timeframes, and that is certainly true for, I'm sure, everyone in the room. I would say we need to keep our resolve to embrace the challenge that exists and to make progress, because we certainly won't make progress otherwise. But it is indeed frustrating. I'm also interested to see that it's desirable that some technologies need to take time to be developed and come to market. I would like to suggest that we also think about the cost-benefit ratio and what is the benefit to risk. So by non-adopting, or if we take a long time to de-risk some things, are we foregoing benefits? And what is the relative size of the benefit to the risk? So.
Thank you. Can we please go to the next question? We're expecting is a word cloud. Ty?
Yeah, I'm not even sure where to start on that. Yes. The one that I had in my mind, though, that kind of summarizes all of this is just execution is the barrier, right? So there's obviously a need, there's a will, there's a passion. We have tools, we've got science, we've got technologies, all of it exists, but how do we execute on it is the hard part. And I think a lot of these are, if you could figure that out, a lot of these would fall into place. The regulations is always going to be a big one for new technologies in small markets. We've got to get a better system of allowing data to flow between similar markets and similar agro-ecosystems. A couple things that we're doing now, we've launched, it's actually been around a while, and a couple different names, called FarmRise. So this is a digital tool that allows growers to access information freely. We've launched it in India. It's now coming online in Africa as well. And so it's like it's an advisor, and it links in markets, it links in technologies, it links in, if you can't identify this pest, it would help you identify that pest. The other one that is probably a little bit more broad sweeping is Better Life Farming. So it's I guess a consortium of sorts now. It doesn't have that many participants, but the ones that are really big are important. It is linking finance to thinking about resiliency of communities where we operate. So if you think about generational and gender resiliency, to make sure that growers over generations and across genders will always be there, that should attract and de-risk some of the financial constraints. So versus having a smallholder focused on his small part of his ecosystem, now you can start to link it to community. And so those are some of the things we're trying to do, but I can't disagree with any of these. These are all things that limit innovation, but if we could figure out how to execute better and more holistically, I think we'd make progress faster.
Thank you, Ty. Let's move to the next one, which is private sector participation in partnerships. Ian, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. I'm going to make a build on the last one as well before I get into this. I think one of my observations is that if you can make change easy, change happens. And the biggest trick is making change easy. And that's about, I think in agriculture, it's about sharing the journey of de-risking change across the value chain. And I was hoping that this might sort of talk to that a little bit, and it does, I think, with the responses talking about leveraging resources and skill sets. But it's leveraging those resources and skill sets for a purpose. And I challenge myself, I challenge my team when we get involved in partnerships to be really clear about what it is that we're trying to do and why that is important to every member of the partnership that you're involved in. Because if you haven't got the psychology of why you're all working together right, you'll fail. And that I think, is a really important lesson, which I wished I'd learnt many decades ago.
Thank you so much. Let's do the last one. Luca, you take that one.
Okay, so let me take it bottom up. I think supporting smallholder farming is kind of okay. It's easy to click. You always are good with that kind of answer. Maybe on the USAID funding, just to say that of course new ways of public-private partnering can help fill the gap. The issue is that there is part of the gap that has been related with this true public good side of things, the pre-breeding, the gene banking, all of these assets that are there for the sake of all, where that funding is very difficult to replace. And we are struggling, we are having issues, and it's not something that public-private partnerships are going to be solving. And then on the middle one, the tie outcomes to market demand, yes, and because we also need to be careful that it's not market demand looking at the numbers, because we then fall into big crops, big areas, the markets of the private sector, but where is our role in terms of opportunity crops, leafy vegetables, communities where we need to focus, and we can go for big solutions at small scale, and those are still markets, and we still need to take care of them.
Thank you, Luca. Let me take this opportunity to say thank you to all the panelists. A lot has been said. We also want to thank the audience for sharing so generously and giving us answer to these questions. Given the 2Blades strategic positioning, I think Diana is well placed to offer closing remarks from this session here. And once again, thank you for organizing this and sharing your 20 years experience from setting a partnership to ensure that we go from innovation to impact very quickly. Thank you.
And I want to especially thank Phil and GEMS for co-hosting this session. So I think we can define the problem that we're all here thinking about is how do we create functional food systems in the face of climate change, the long time frames to bring innovation. We all understand it's incredibly complex. And we all understand that we need innovation to address these changes, and we need partnerships. But the question that this panel has spoken to, I think with a lot of good examples, is how can we reimagine those partnerships to really deliver on the goal of delivering impact from innovation. And what you've heard in many examples here is that aligning incentives is critical, thinking about markets and what products are going to be perpetuated because they're needed. And also I would say that having the breadth and depth of this whole process, the innovation chain, so being able to think not just in your area of expertise, but think along the whole process and who are going to be those key partners as you go through, acknowledging that individual members of the process have a certain depth of expertise. So spanning that breadth and depth together is the way you achieve the whole thing. It's complicated. I think we got some really nice examples of the win-wins out there and making sure that incentives, as Ian said, had the duality of market value. For example, Ian, you spoke about the oat genome and future farms. Those are great examples and focusing on resilience of the supply chains. Phil, you talked about access with public and private data and how you partition that access to serve both needs. Ty, you mentioned the banana case was a good example of a win-win in giving away IP outside of your core areas of interest. And Juanluca, when you talked about how the CG has made a change in thinking about IP and embracing public and private partnerships from that, I think those are all excellent examples of these win-wins that we're trying to describe as a solution here. And the impact of successfully doing these things is that all the partners are invested in the success of the effort. They all have some skin in the game and want it to succeed. It's not just a do-good sort of situation. And that can lead to gaining efficiencies and speed because we understand these are urgent long-term problems that we need to act now. The die is being cast, as Phil said, and that we can meet the demand where it is and help people earn income. It's a kind of enlightened self-interest. So I just want to leave everybody with a call to action, hopefully from taking away some of these thoughts, which would be to think globally across these complex systems, but act locally where you can with the right partners that will facilitate what you can bring to the process. And seek not just partnerships for the sake of partnerships, but those that really find those mutual benefits. And it's a process, a bit more work. But I think, as Ian, you were saying, it's good to figure it out earlier on than later. And then lastly, for innovators especially, to think beyond take it to the farmers. That's a cry we've heard many times. And of course, we want to enable farmers to help feed the world. But we also want to tie that to thinking about markets. So those are calls to action as you participate in these complex systems. Thank you.
Thank you, audience, for sticking there. So thanks a lot.